I always link it back to, so I'm economist by education. In economics, there's a term called physics envy. Basically is that all the economists are envious of all the physicists because they get to do math to describe the natural world with these beautiful equations. And it's just like you write an equation and boom, you're done, right? Like this is how gravity works. There's no person for whom it might work a little bit different. So economics has gotten a lot math heavy, right? And I feel there's a little bit of a similar trend in VC where like the VC funds have like looked at Renaissance Capital with their medallion fund that's returned like 60% IRR since like the early 90s. They looked at Jane Street, Citadel, etc. I'm like, that sounds awesome. I really want that IRR as well. How do I get that, right? And then they're kind of like, what can we take from that? And I think if you want to kind of like go deep into those things, I think there's two things that are quite materially different. Even though both of those are like investments as asset classes, there's a liquidity aspect and then there's a human aspect. So the liquidity aspect is basically is that VC funds invest in stuff that's extremely illiquid, right? So VC fund, you'll tend to go in, invest over 10 years, and then expect like there's going to be an IPO or an M&A, but it's going to happen like 8 years from now, which basically means you put in your money, you work with the company, but you don't like trade out of like startup A to go into startup B, and then out of that to go into startup C, depending on what's hot right now. And that's just completely different versus like a quant, like equities market fund, right? For example, where you might hold like an equity for a few days or a week at most, and then you trade in and out, and then you get like, if you get like a swing of like a percent on each trade, that's amazing. Whereas like if you get a percentage upside on each like trade in VC, it's horrible. So like there's a liquidity element that's just extremely difficult to kind of like transpose from like public markets to the venture capital markets, which just makes it structurally very difficult. And then there's a secondary piece, which is like the human element. You can do a lot of like the quantitative elements in terms of like describing what's out there, identifying potential companies, describing kind of the market size and stuff like that. But like the earlier that you go, the more the human elements just matters, right? So for example, if you go out and you invest in a company that's a month old, essentially the only thing you have to invest in is the people. Like they'll probably don't have any traction. They might not have a product. The product, if they have a product, you basically can't test it. So the only thing you invest in is people. And if you invest in people, you basically have to analyze them, but you also have to talk with them. Because if I invest in someone, I have to work with these people. Coming back to the liquidity question, you have to work with them for like 10 years. You might be on their board. You'll have shares. You can be extremely annoying if you don't agree with like the direction of the company. You might even be able to help or to instigate a firing of the CEO. So it's very important that you work well as a fund together with the company. And that goes for both sides, right? You want to make sure as a fund, you have companies that you can work with. And as a founder, you want to make sure that you have VC funds that you trust and you trust it is in your best interest and can give you advice, right? So I think you can, going back to your question, Markus, I think you can automate a lot of kind of like the work leading up to the actual investment. But there's just a human element that's extremely difficult to take out because you have to work with these people. And obviously everything here I'm saying is like with the caveat that it might be completely different in 2 years because of kind of like the rapid evolvement of AI. But at least right now, that's the way we see it, which is also why we don't see ourselves as like displacing a VC fund, because that's just, then you're completely removing the human element, which is just so important.